The storm reached Wrentham Hall at 3 in the afternoon, and by nightfall, it had swallowed the world entire. Cecily had not meant to be in his chamber. She had not meant to be at Wrentham Hall at all, precisely, in the way that one does not mean to be caught in a current, and yet finds oneself swept past every landmark one thought would hold. She had been following the light. The candle she carried had guttered in the corridor draught, and without it the east wing's dark was absolute, the kind that pressed against the eyes and made one doubt the arrangement of one's own hands. She had put her palm to the nearest door and pushed, expecting the linen closet, the cedar smell of stored fabric, the quiet, inanimate dark of useful things. Instead, she found a room that breathed, a fire still burning, a man standing at the window, his back to her, his hand against the broken casement frame where the wind came through in a thin, cold blade. The flame in the hearth bent sideways and recovered. He turned. James Ashford, Duke of Wrentham, had a face that gave very little away. She had been at Wrentham Hall for 11 days as companion to Lady Grantham, who had been invited for the shooting party and then marooned here by the weather. And in those 11 days, Cecily had watched the Duke preside over dinner and over the long, dull evenings with an equal, measured remoteness, as though the house and everyone in it were a problem he was managing at a slight distance. He was not a young man in the sense of being untried. He was perhaps 34, and the years between whatever he had been and what he was now had settled into his jaw and his hands, and the particular stillness of his expression, like stone that has been worked and left. He looked at her across the firelit room. The broken casement howled. "I beg your pardon," Cecily said. Her voice was entirely level. She had learned to keep it so. "I mistook the door." She stepped back. His hand moved to the latch before she reached it, not threateningly, only with a kind of swift certainty. And the sound of the key turning was the sound of the storm deciding something on her behalf. "The window is out," he said. "The cold will be in every room on this corridor before morning. You are not leaving until the frame is repaired." She stood with her extinguished candle in her hand and looked at the locked door, and then at him, and understood that he was not being improper. He was being efficient. The distinction, she had learned, was the only one available to her in this house. This is the story of the night. The storm gave Cecily an accidental honesty, and the days that followed, in which a man who had locked the door against the cold discovered that he had also, without meaning to, locked in the thing that would cost him most to keep. If this is the kind of story you return to when you need to believe that quiet dignity eventually finds its witness, stay with it a while. It has not been told in a hurry. She had arrived at Wrentham Hall as companion to Lady Grantham on the 12th of December, having accepted the position 6 weeks after her father's death made it necessary. The facts of her situation were these. Her father had left no estate worth speaking of. A modest debt of £120 accumulated against her younger brother Silas's school fees, and 2 daughters, of whom her elder sister had married well and moved to Bristol, and considered the matter of Cecily concluded. Cecily was 24, sufficiently educated, sufficiently plain in her dress by habit and necessity, and possessed of the particular self-containment that develops in women who have learned that display is a luxury they cannot afford. She had accepted £40 per year for the position and sent 20 of it north to cover what Silas needed above his current allowance. The arithmetic was manageable only so long as nothing went wrong. She had been nursing her father through his final illness for 2 years before his death, which meant she knew how to sit in a sick room through the long hours, how to cool a fever with a damp cloth and a steady hand, how to read aloud to someone whose restlessness would not permit sleep, and whose anxiety needed the anchor of a human voice. She had not expected this skill to matter at Wrentham Hall. She had expected to pour tea and hand shawls and be invisible. She had, indeed, been largely invisible. Lady Dorothea Ashford, the Dowager Duchess of Wrentham, managed the house party with the precision of a woman who has been arranging the social world to her satisfaction for 30 years and regards any deviation as a personal affront. The Dowager was not cruel. She was something more difficult than cruel. She was accurate in the way that a precisely aimed instrument is accurate, and she had taken Cecily's measure within 40 minutes of her arrival and filed her appropriately. At dinner, on the second evening, in a private exchange with her particular companion, Mrs. Finch, the Dowager had said, with a pleasant smile and a voice pitched just far enough to carry, that Lady Grantham was kind to bring her little helper along, but that companions in house parties were rather like umbrellas left by previous guests, useful to have but never quite in their right place. Cecily, seated 2 chairs down, had continued eating her soup. Miss Philippa Vane, the Dowager's chosen candidate for the Duke's second marriage, was 4 years younger than Cecily, and wore her confidence the way she wore her sapphire earrings, as though both had been fitted specifically for her, and she had never doubted the fit. She was genuinely beautiful, genuinely accomplished, and she had been raised to understand that the Duke of Wrentham was the correct conclusion to her story. She was not unkind to Cecily. She simply did not see her. In this she was more honest than most. Then the storm had arrived, as Cecily had said, and it had arrived with conviction. The Derbyshire hills vanished behind it. The road to the nearest town, 7 miles of rutted winter track, became impassable by the second hour. By evening, the house party had accepted that they were confined, and the drawing-room had taken on the particular social quality of people maintaining propriety under mild duress, which is to say the propriety had grown somewhat more deliberate, and the conversation somewhat more intent. Cecily had been sent to fetch a shawl from Lady Grantham's room when her candle went out. And so she stood in the Duke's chamber with an extinguished candle in her hand, and the wind finding the gap in the broken frame, and the locked door behind her, and the fire doing what it could. He had not moved far from the window. He was watching her with that measured quality she had noticed across 12 days of careful observation, the look of a man who is calculating something he has not named aloud. She was aware that her hair had come slightly undone in the dark corridor, and that the cold had put color in her face that she would have preferred to withhold, and that her gown, plain brown wool, was entirely honest about her circumstances in a room hung with good paintings and lit by a generous fire. There was a sound from the inner room, a child's cough, ragged and wet. The Duke's expression shifted. Not much. Something tightened in it. "Your ward," Cecily said, not as a question. "Thomas." He said the name carefully. "He has had a cold since yesterday. His nurse is in the south wing with a sprained ankle." Cecily set her spent candle on the mantelpiece and went to the inner door. He said, "Miss Hartwell," with a particular authority. And she paused with her hand on the frame and looked back at him. "I nursed my father for 2 years before he died," she said. "I know what a child's fever wants. If Thomas is worse than a cold, you will need someone who can sit with him." He said nothing for a moment. Then he moved aside. Thomas was 8 years old, small for it, with dark hair plastered to his forehead, and a restless turning that spoke of a fever, climbing rather than breaking. He had kicked the covers half off and was shivering beneath them. Cecily sat on the edge of the narrow bed and put her wrist to his forehead. An old habit learned at her father's side, and the heat against her pulse was enough to confirm what she had guessed. "Water," she said quietly. "Cold water and a basin, a cloth, and whatever he most likes to be read." She heard the Duke cross the outer room. She heard him open the door and speak in low tones to someone in the corridor, presumably a footman still at his post, and then the door shut again, and the household sounds outside receded into the storm. Thomas opened his eyes. They were his uncle's eyes, gray and level, but without the restraint. A child of 8 cannot manage his face. "Are you the fairy?" he asked, with the logical sincerity of fever. "No," Cecily said. "I am Miss Hartwell. I am going to read to you." "What will you read?" "Whatever you prefer. But first I'm going to make you drink some water." He drank without fuss, which told her he was not frightened, only feverish and slightly confused about the fairy question. She found the book on his beside table, a well-worn copy of Gulliver's Travels with a broken spine and margins annotated in a child's recent pencil. She opened it to the beginning, though she suspected they had been to Lilliput many times, and began to read. Her voice in a sick room was a different instrument than her voice elsewhere. It settled and deepened without her consciously choosing it, finding the cadence that made language into something physical, something a body in distress could lean against. She had discovered this at her father's bedside, and had never spoken of it, because it was the kind of knowledge that mattered only in the dark, and could not be displayed at dinner. She did not look up when the Duke returned with the basin and cloth. She moved through the chapter. Thomas's breathing steadied slowly, the restlessness in his hands giving way first, then the rigid quality leaving his shoulders, and by the end of the second chapter, he was somewhere between sleeping and the deep listening of the very young, which is its own kind of rest. The fire in the outer room sent warmth through the open door. The storm shook the windows. Cecily turned the page. She did not know, and could not have known, that the Duke had taken a chair in the doorway between the two rooms and was watching her. She was too focused on the child's breathing and the page to notice the quality of the silence behind her, to read the particular stillness of a man who has stopped mid-movement because something in the scene before him has interrupted his capacity for motion. He had come to take the basin to her, and had simply stopped. The cloth was still in his hand. He had been standing in that doorway for 20 minutes before he knew it. What he saw was a woman in a plain brown gown sitting upright on the edge of a child's sickbed in the small hours of a winter storm, reading aloud to his ward with a steadiness that had nothing to do with observation and everything to do with the work itself. She was not performing care. She was simply caring, which was an entirely different thing. And James Ashford, who had spent 3 years cataloging the difference, recognized it immediately and wished he had not. He set the basin quietly on the side table. She looked up. "Thank you," she said in the same quiet voice, and looked back at the page. He went to the chair in the doorway. He sat in it. He did not go to bed. By morning, Thomas's fever had broken to a manageable warmth. Cecily had dozed once in the chair by his bedside, perhaps an hour, her head tipped sideways against the high back. The Duke was asleep in the outer room's wing chair when she woke, still in his clothes. The fire burned low. She did not wake him. She refreshed the cloth on Thomas's forehead, checked that he was breathing easily, and went quietly to the outer room to leave. The key was still in the lock. She turned it slowly. The corridor was gray with early light and cold with the night's chill. She closed his door behind her without sound and went back to the south wing to restore herself for the day before Lady Grantham required her. She did not see Mrs. Potts in the passage. The housekeeper, a square and sensible woman of 50 years' service at Wrentham Hall, saw her. And what Mrs. Potts saw was a young woman in yesterday's gown, coming quietly out of the east wing at first light, with a face that wore the particular exhaustion of someone who had been up all night at a difficult task, not the bright-eyed recklessness of a woman who had done something she should not have done. Mrs. Potts, who had known Thomas since his father died 3 years earlier, and who had been unable to reach the child last night due to the storm's arrangement of things, understood the arithmetic at once. She tucked it away and said nothing, and went about her morning. The storm did not lift on the second day. It pressed closer, and the house party contracted further inward, and the drawing room's propriety grew more deliberate still. The dowager found occasion, in the middle morning, to address Lady Grantham directly on the subject of the house party's composition. Mrs. Finch was present. Miss Vane was present, and she was wearing her rose silk, which was exactly the right color for the gray light and which she knew it. The dowager observed that the current weather was perfectly suited to quiet domestic intimacy, and that she had always found large parties less productive than small, carefully chosen ones, and that she trusted Lady Grantham's little companion had been kept comfortably occupied and was not finding the confinement too tedious, since girls of that sort, pleasant enough as they were, sometimes struggled to find their footing in a house of this standing. Lady Grantham said yes. Yes, Cecily was quite comfortable, and changed the subject. Cecily, seated at the far window with her mending, looked out at the snow. There was nothing to express that would have served her. The Duke came down to luncheon. Thomas, he reported, was much recovered, and would be well enough for a soft supper if the fever stayed down. He said this generally, to the table, and then he said, without looking directly at her, but with a specificity that could not have been aimed elsewhere, "Thomas is asking for Miss Hartwell. He appears to have formed a strong attachment to Gulliver's Travels." The table received this information. Miss Vane's expression managed the shift smoothly. The dowager's fan moved one slow, deliberate degree in Cecily's direction. "How resourceful," the dowager said pleasantly, "to know how to make oneself useful." It was the label's second voicing, wrapped in something that sounded like approval and was not. In the afternoon, when the household had settled into its various occupations and the corridors were quiet, Cecily encountered the Duke in the library. He was standing at the window with a book open in his hands that he was not reading. On the wall behind the writing table, there was a portrait turned face inward, its canvas back to the room, which was the kind of deliberate reversal that drew the eye precisely because it defied explanation. She was looking for a specific volume for Lady Grantham. She found it. She ought to have left. He said without turning. She preferred winter. Eleanor. She said the house was most itself in the snow. Cecily stood very still, the found volume under her arm. "The child she carried did not survive," he said. "Neither did she." He turned a page he was not reading. "I was in the East Wing when it began. Not with her. I had been sent for, but I was not there in time." He paused. "Thomas arrived the following year, from my brother's household, and I found that I could manage his welfare rather better at a distance." He said this last part with a precise flatness that contained its own indictment. "I have not been especially present." He closed the book. The turned portrait was not a memorial so much as a question he had been living with for 3 years and had not answered. Cecily understood this because she had sat with her own version of that question, the particular weight of a life defined by someone else's ending. "You were present last night," she said carefully. He looked at her then, fully, in the way that she had not been looked at fully by anyone in this house, and perhaps in some considerable time before it. "You did not sleep," he said. "Thomas needed someone to stay awake. That was not your obligation." "No," she agreed. "It was not." The silence between them had the quality of an open window, not uncomfortable, but wide. He said, "I have spoken with Mrs. Potts this morning." She waited. "She tells me Thomas's fever began yesterday afternoon and that his nurse could not be reached. She tells me you were in the east corridor when the storm broke the casement. He set the book on the shelf behind him. She tells me a great deal that she considers relevant to my understanding of the previous 12 hours. Mrs. Potts is thorough, Cecily said. Something changed in his face. It was not a smile, precisely. It was the approach of one, a movement in that direction that stopped where habit stopped it. He said, "She is." Cecily excused herself and went back to Lady Grantham. The book under her arm was warm from where her hand had pressed it. The warmth stayed with her longer than it should have, and she did not examine the reason closely, because she could not afford the conclusions. There were 4 more encounters in the storm's second day, each one shorter and more charged than the preceding, as tends to happen when 2 people discover they occupy the same silences. She brought Thomas his supper tray and found the Duke already there, sitting on the edge of the ward's bed with a wooden horse in his hands, attempting to repair a broken leg with the focused inexpertness of a man who has never been taught to do this and is too proud to send for help. She sat with them an hour. Thomas talked about Lilliput, and the Duke listened with genuine attention, and Cecily watched a man attempting to be present, imperfectly, honestly, in the way that effort looks when it is actual effort, and not performance. Later, in the corridor outside the drawing room, he handed her a cup of tea he had obtained for her, because she had declined to cross the room herself when the Dowager was in full occupation of it. He said nothing. She took the cup. Their fingers did not touch, because she was careful, and because he was careful, and because care of that sort is its own language. In the evening, he turned the pages of her book when she could not reach the lamp, and her hands were occupied with Lady Grantham's correspondence. He did not offer or explain. He simply turned the page when she reached the end of one, watching her face rather than the text. She kept her eyes on the letters. After Lady Grantham retired and the room had emptied down to the last 2, he said her name, not Miss Hartwell. Her given name, Cecily, which was not his right, and which he had not the technical standing to use, and which he said as though he was testing whether it fit, whether the word matched the weight of the person. She stood at the door and did not turn around, because if she turned around, the evening would have become something the morning could not recover from. She said good night, Miss Hartwell, quietly, addressing herself, correcting the presumption, and went upstairs. She lay in her small room in the south wing and listened to the storm, and thought about £40 per year, and £120 outstanding, and 7 miles of impassable road, and the specific impossibility of being this particular woman in this particular house at this particular moment. She thought about the turned portrait, and the man who had not been in time and had been punishing himself with an empty room for 3 years. She did not sleep well. The following morning, the storm began to ease. By noon, the roads were reported passable, and the house party stirred with the energy of people who had been politely confined and were adjusting to the prospect of freedom. In this stirring, the Dowager found her moment. It was constructed carefully, as the Dowager's constructions always were. A gathering in the drawing room after luncheon. Lady Grantham present, and Miss Vane, and several of the other guests, and the Duke reading dispatches near the window. Mrs. Finch positioned where she always was, at the Dowager's left hand, like a well-trained echo. The Dowager addressed Lady Grantham with every appearance of warm solicitude. She observed that the house party had been rather thrown together by the weather, and that she feared the intimacy of the confinement might have given some of the more marginal members of their little group a mistaken impression of their welcome. She said it was always difficult when persons of uneven standing found themselves in close proximity for extended periods, since misunderstanding naturally arose, as it was only human to confuse proximity for connection. She said she felt she could rely upon Lady Grantham to convey to her companion, kindly but clearly, that the roads were now passable, and that it might be better for everyone if the less essential guests made their arrangements to depart that afternoon, while the weather held. She said companion with the precisely measured weight of someone who has chosen that word deliberately, to place a person and keep them placed. This was the third voicing, and it fell in front of the room. Lady Grantham said nothing, because Lady Grantham was kind but not courageous, and the silence lasted 1 second, and then 2. Cecily sat with it. She sat with the familiar sound of herself being reduced to a utility. The sound that had followed her since the funeral, since the solicitor's letter. Since the morning she had understood that her father's death had removed the one person in the world whose good opinion of her was not conditional on her usefulness. She sat with it, and then she set down her mending. She said, in a voice that was steady because she had trained it to be so, and also because she was, at this moment, past pretending, "I believe Lady Dorothea is speaking about me." The room attended to this. "I appreciate her concern for the house party's comfort," Cecily continued. "And I will, of course, make whatever arrangements Lady Grantham requires. Before I do, I would ask your ladyship's indulgence for one correction. I came to be in this house as Lady Grantham's companion. I did not come to importune his grace or to misunderstand my position. I sat with Thomas Ashford through his fever on the first night of the storm because the child was ill, and the door to the east wing happened to be in front of me, and I was, unlike others, in a position to help. I did not expect anything in return. I did not ask for anything. I mention this not to claim credit, but to clarify the nature of the misunderstanding, since it appears the misunderstanding has been of an entirely different sort than Lady Dorothea suggests." She picked up her mending. The room was very quiet. The dowager's fan had stilled at a precise angle, and her expression held the controlled quality of a woman recalculating. Miss Vane looked at her own hands. Mrs. Finch found something of apparent interest in the middle distance. The sound of the fire in the hearth was audible. Then the sound of footsteps crossing the drawing-room floor from the window, unhurried and deliberate. James Ashford stopped beside Cecily's chair. He did not address the room. He addressed her. "Mrs. Potts came to me this morning," he said. "She wished me to know that Thomas has been asking for you since breakfast, and that he has developed the firm opinion that Gulliver's Travels can only be properly understood in your voice." He paused. "She also wished me to know several other things, which I already knew, and which I find I no longer have any inclination to keep to myself." He looked at his mother. Something passed between them that was old and complicated, and belonged to a history Cecily could not entirely read, and then he looked back at her. "I intend to speak to you this afternoon," he said, "at your convenience. Not as an employer, not as your hostess's son, as a man with a specific question." The dowager sat very straight in her chair, and her fan closed in her hand, and Cecily watched the certainty in her expression give way, not to collapse, not to cruelty, but to the quieter, more difficult thing, which was the recognition that her script had reached the edge of its territory and would not go further. She was not destroyed. She was not humiliated in front of the room. She was simply, finally, and publicly wrong, and she knew it, and the room knew she knew it. Miss Vane looked at the window. Her expression was composed. Her hands in her lap were perfectly still, and she would not look at Cecily, not from malice but from the particular dignity of a woman removing herself from a competition she had not expected to lose. She was not unkind. She simply, at last, saw the field clearly. Lady Grantham said, with a small relieved warmth, "How fortunate that Thomas has someone who reads so well." Cecily sat with the mending in her hands and the fire at her back, and the knowledge that her heart was conducting itself very badly, beating in the way it had no business beating in a drawing room in front of assembled company, and that her face was going to remain entirely level, regardless, because she had built it that way. James spoke to her in the library at 4 o'clock. The storm had given way entirely, and the winter light through the window was pale and clear, and it fell on the turned portrait on the wall, which had its canvas back to the room still, which had its back to the room, until Cecily, crossing to the window, put her hand to the frame and turned it. Eleanor Ashford had been brown-haired and direct-eyed, painted at perhaps 23, with the specific quality of self-possession in a face that has been well-loved. She looked like someone who would have preferred winter, actually. She looked exactly like someone who would have said the house was most itself in the snow. James watched Cecily look at his dead wife's portrait for a moment, and said nothing. "She deserves to be seen," Cecily said. "Whatever happened, she deserves not to be turned from the room." He came to stand beside her. Not close. Close enough that she could have named the distance. "I'm going to ask you something," he said. "Yes," she said carefully. "You mentioned—" "I'm going to ask you before I explain why, because the explanation may seem as though it is the reason, and I do not want it to be the reason." He paused. "I have £120 of your brother's school debt in my possession. My solicitor acquired it yesterday morning when I requested he look into your circumstances. I have no intention of using it as a condition or a lever. It will be settled regardless of your answer. But I want you to know it exists, and that it is done, so that what I ask next is unambiguous." Cecily set her hands very still at her sides. "I am asking whether you would be willing to remain at Wrentham Hall," he said. "Not as a companion, not as a governess, as the person Thomas asks for every morning, and as the person who turned my wife's portrait back to the room." He looked at Eleanor's portrait. "As my wife, if you will have me. On the understanding that I have not managed this well historically, and that I will attempt to manage it better, and that Thomas already has a view on the subject that he expressed to Mrs. Potts this morning in terms that I am told were rather direct." The pale winter light came through the window on the two of them. She said, "What did Thomas say exactly?" Something in him released, not dramatically, not with visible motion. It was simply that the carved quality of his face rearranged itself very slightly, and the man inside it became briefly, wholly present. He said that Miss Hartwell understands Gulliver properly, and that he would like her to stay, and that if his uncle failed to arrange this satisfactorily, he would write to the king. "He is 8, Cecily said. "He is very confident in his correspondence." She looked at the portrait, then she looked at James, and said, with the precision of someone choosing honesty over safety, "I'm going to say yes because I want to, not because of Silas's debt, which you should know regardless of whether it changes your assessment of the answer." "It does not change my assessment," he said. "I suspected," she said. "You are not especially subtle for a man who works very hard at appearing so." The approach of a smile, again. This time it arrived. The coda settled over Wrentham Hall gently, the way good things settle, not with announcement, but with weight. Silas arrived from school a week before Christmas, traveling the 7 miles from the nearest town in one of the estate's carriages, 17 years old and slightly bewildered by the transformation in his sister's circumstances and very much not bewildered by the quality of the dinner table, which he approached with the appetite of a boy who has been living on school food and the understanding that this was going to improve. Thomas found in him an immediate ally of exactly the right age difference, old enough to be interesting and young enough to be recruited into various schemes involving the back lawn, a set of wooden soldiers, and ambitions for the snow that required adult supervision, and received it from James with the focused inexpertness of a man who is learning to be present and is doing so with genuine effort. The debt of £120 had been settled by James's solicitor on the 4th of December, 2 days before Cecily had known to hope for it. The fact of it was stated plainly to her over the household accounts that she had taken over from Mrs. Potts, who yielded them with the satisfied expression of someone who has been waiting for this eventuality for some time. The number did not appear again in the ledger. It was simply gone, which was the correct shape for it to take. Lady Dorothea remained at Wrentham Hall through Christmas because she was its dowager, and because the house was large enough to contain the adjustment she was required to make, and because James had not dismissed her or diminished her, only placed himself clearly and let the placement speak. She was, on the second week, observed by Mrs. Potts to have a conversation with Cecily about the kitchen garden that lasted 20 minutes and contained no visible sharpness. Whether this was reconciliation or mere retrenchment, Mrs. Potts wisely declined to speculate. The dowager called her Cecily twice in that conversation, without apparent strain. Miss Vane had departed on the afternoon of the drawing-room reckoning, accompanied by her maid and her rose silk and her composure, which she had maintained beautifully throughout. She had wished Lady Grantham a pleasant journey, and had not looked back. On Christmas Eve, the snow came again, this time softly, without the storm's conviction, falling in the way that snow falls when it is only being decorative, and knows it. Cecily stood at the library window with James beside her, and watched it come down on the lawns and the kitchen garden and the long stone face of the house, which was very much itself in the winter light, as Eleanor had said, and she held that small fact gently, the way one holds something that belongs to someone else and has been given into one's keeping. Thomas was upstairs, finally sleeping, Silas in the adjoining room with a book he had borrowed from the library without asking, and with James's full awareness. The fire in the library had been burning since afternoon, and the room had the warm, particular smell of old books and good wood and a house at rest with itself. James said her name, Cecily, in the dark way he had said it that first night in the corridor, the way that had no technical right behind it, and needed none now. She turned from the window. The portrait of Eleanor Ashford hung on the library wall behind the writing table, facing the room, her brown eyes forward and her expression that of a woman who would have approved of exactly this arrangement. The single candle on the mantelpiece sent its light up the painted face and across the books and along the edge of Cecily's gown, which was no longer plain brown wool but deep green, the first new thing she had permitted herself, and which fit her as things fit when they have been chosen rather than endured. Outside, the snow fell on Derbyshire. Inside, the fire held. She was home.